Steady now. Precision is everything.
Yes, sir. Almost there.
Good. Check the bolt.
Clear, sir.
The Barrett was already field stripped before the sun came up. Staff Sergeant Lena Carver had been in the armory since 5:45, working by the pale light of a single fluorescent tube that hummed with the quiet persistence of something left on too long. The other lights were off. She preferred it that way. Less exposure, less visibility. A habit so deeply ingrained that she applied it even here in a domestic military installation in the middle of Arizona, even when there was no tactical reason for it whatsoever. Old habits. The Barrett M8 2A1 lay across the cleaning mat in front of her, like the bones of something enormous and ancient, each component separated with a precision that went beyond training. The bolt carrier group sat to her left, wiped clean of carbon, the barrel extension to her right. The upper receiver in the center. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. The ritual of it was the point, not just the result. She was 28 years old and she had been taking this rifle apart and putting it back together for 6 years. She could do it in complete darkness, which she had done on 3 separate occasions for reasons she was not permitted to discuss. She could do it with her left arm in a sling, which she had done once in a forward operating base outside Kandahar in the winter of 2022, with a medical officer standing 3 feet away telling her to stop. She had not stopped. She never stopped until the rifle was clean. Carver pulled a bore brush through the barrel with the measured patience of a person who understood that the difference between a miss and a hit at extreme distance was almost always a decision made hours before the shot, not in the moment of it. Most people never learned that. Most people thought precision shooting was about the finger on the trigger. It was not. It was about everything that happened before the finger ever touched the metal. The armory at Camp Ridgeway, Arizona was a long rectangular building made of reinforced concrete that had been absorbing desert heat since 1987. At 6 in the morning in August, the air conditioning was already fighting a losing battle. By noon, it would be a formality. The building smelled like gun oil and spent metal and the particular institutional cleaner the military used on every floor of every building on every base in the country, a smell Carver had grown up inside without ever choosing to. She had not chosen any of this exactly. That was not quite right either. She had chosen it completely. She had just not known at the time what she was actually choosing. There was a photograph in the breast pocket of her uniform jacket folded twice, along the same creases it had been folded along for 11 years. She did not take it out. She did not need to. She knew every detail of it, the way she knew the dimensions of the Barrett's chamber, not because she had memorized it consciously, but because she had spent enough time with it that it had become part of the architecture of her mind. A young man in army dress uniform grinning at a camera in a backyard in Montana. 22 years old, a sunset behind him that turned the whole sky orange and red above the mountains. Specialist Daniel Carver. 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division, Fort Drum, New York. She refolded the cleaning patch and moved to the next component. The armory began to fill at 0700. Soldiers arrived in groups, signing out weapons carrying gear to their assigned stations. None of them approached the far corner where Carver worked. She had arranged herself there deliberately behind a rack of M4 carbines that provided just enough visual separation from the rest of the floor to create the impression of privacy without technically violating any regulation. The morning routine moved around her like water around a stone. She preferred it that way too. At 0830, the main doors opened with the particular weight of official entry, and General Marcus Harwell walked into the armory. She knew it was him before she looked up. 30 soldiers came to attention with the coordinated reflex of people who had spent enough time in uniform that certain responses became autonomic. The sound of it was distinctive, the collective shift of weight and posture, the cessation of small sounds. Carver did not look up from the bolt carrier group she was inspecting under her penlight. She was not being disrespectful. She simply did not need to look up to understand what was happening. She had been expecting something like this for 4 days, not him specifically, just someone noticing. She had told them putting her in a general population base was a risk. The people she answered to had decided the risk was acceptable. She had executed that decision without further comment because that was what she did. But she had known with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything that someone would notice eventually. The only variable had been who and when. The answer was a 3-star general. Monday morning, 0830, she kept working. Harwell moved through the armory with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing inspections for so long that his body did it while his mind occupied itself elsewhere. Lieutenant Colonel Sean Voss followed 3 steps behind, tablet in hand, making notes in the efficient shorthand of a man who understood that the real work of a military installation was documentation. They moved through the rows of weapon stations with methodical thoroughness, and Carver tracked their approach in her peripheral vision with the calm attention she would have given a weather system developing on the horizon. She registered the exact moment Harwell saw the Barrett. His stride changed, not dramatically. A fraction of a second's hesitation between one step and the next, so subtle that only someone who had spent years reading body language at distances where facial expressions were invisible would have caught it. He redirected toward her corner with the calm authority of a man accustomed to having his curiosity answered. "Carry on," she nodded once and kept her hands moving. He stood watching for 40 seconds. She counted them. Not because she needed to, but because counting was a reflex like breathing. She continued working through the bolt carrier group and some inspection, turning each component in, the light checking surfaces, checking tolerances, returning each piece to its designated position on the mat. When she stood at attention, it was because his silence had acquired a specific quality. The quality of someone who had just read something unexpected and was reading it again. She knew what he had read. The badge was small and not decorative. It contained one line of text and a set of numbers and nothing else. It was not the kind of thing that advertised itself, but it was the kind of thing that once seen by someone with enough experience to understand what they were looking at became impossible to unsee. 3,200 meters, confirmed kill. General Marcus Harwell was 52 years old. He had served in the mountains of Afghanistan when those mountains still had enemies in them. He had served in Fallujah during the period when Fallujah was the most dangerous city on earth. He had read classified briefings most three-star generals never saw. His clearances went deep enough into the operational world to make most people uncomfortable. He had never seen or heard of a shot at this distance. She watched the calculation move through his eyes. First confusion, then the recalibration of a man checking what he knew against what he was seeing. The world record. 3,540 meters, Canadian Joint Task Force to Iraq 2017. He would know that number. Men like Harwell kept that kind of number. This badge claimed 3,200. 340 meters behind the world record. Never mentioned, never briefed, never documented in anything he had ever read. The word that came out of him was a single syllable with the weight of a command behind it. Soldier. Nearby weapon stations went quiet. Carver straightened to a position that was technically attention, but carried none of the rigidity that sometimes accompanied it. She had been standing at attention in high-stress situations since she was 20 years old. Her body knew how to do it without her mind having to manage it. She gave him her name, rank, unit, and current assignment in the order protocol required. 2nd Battalion 75th Ranger Regiment, currently assigned to Special Operations Task Force Detachment, Charlie. When he asked about the badge, she told him what she was authorized to tell him. Syria, 2023, classified operation. He said Syria the way men said the name of a place that was not supposed to be on the map. She had heard that exact tone before in debriefs, in over secure lines, and in face-to-face conversations in rooms with no windows. She had learned to receive it without reaction. When he asked her to explain the technical requirements of a shot at that distance, something in his voice changed. He was no longer performing an inspection. He was a man trying to understand something that did not fit inside the categories he had built over 27 years. She explained it the way she always explained it when required. Not to impress, not to perform expertise, to convey accurate information to someone who needed it to understand what they were looking at. Wind at multiple altitudes, temperature gradients along the bullet's entire flight path, barometric pressure and its rate of change. Bullet drop at 3,200 meters, approximately 420 feet of vertical compensation required before the round arrived at its intended point in space. Spin drift, the rightward drift caused by rifling that accumulated to 14 inches at this range. The Coriolis effect. So, the last one stopped him. Voss said it first the way people said things when they had heard the words before but never needed to apply them. The Coriolis effect. The rotation of the Earth, Carver told him. At 3,200 meters, the planet moves enough during the bullet's flight time that you have to compensate for it. Depending on your latitude and the direction you are firing, it can shift your point of impact by 8 to 10 inches. You account for it before the shot. She watched his face absorb that. He was a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers in conditions that tested every dimension of human capability, and he was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who had just encountered a boundary he had not known existed. Then Voss cleared his throat. Sir, her service record. He had pulled it up without being asked. He turned the tablet so Harwell could see. The screen showed Carver's basic information, name, rank, date of birth, serial number, and then nothing. Black bars and classification warnings where deployment history should have been. Performance evaluations reduced to access restriction notices. 14 deployments listed by number only. All results classified, all locations classified, all team composition classified, which in this case meant none. She had gone alone every time. Omega-level boss said, above general officer access for most sections. Harwell studied the screen. He had seen classified files before. His own service record had sections requiring elevated clearance. But 87%, that was the classification level reserved for people whose existence was itself a strategic consideration. Then Voss stopped scrolling. His expression changed, not dramatically, the slight compression around his eyes of a man who had found something that did not fit where it was sitting. Sir, this message from Director Sloan. He turned the tablet again. The message was standard in its language, a directive to cease inquiry, formatted precisely as such communications were formatted, bearing the header of the JSOC Special Access Programs Office. Harwell read it. He read it again. Then Voss said it quietly, as if speaking it too loudly might alter what it meant. This message was composed 4 minutes and 17 seconds before you approached Sergeant Carver's position in this armory, sir. Harwell looked at his watch. He looked at the timestamp on the tablet. He looked at his watch again. The armory around them continued its morning routine with the indifferent consistency of an institution that did not pause for the discoveries of individuals. Weapons were being cleaned. Soldiers were moving between stations. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone had known Harwell would notice the badge before Harwell had noticed the badge. Someone had been watching this space, this soldier, this specific corner of this building carefully enough to anticipate the moment a 3-star general's inspection route would bring him close enough to read what was on her uniform. Harwell did not ask Voss who had sent the alert that allowed the message to be precomposed. He was not certain he wanted the answer to that question. He looked toward the corner where Carver stood waiting, her expression revealing nothing, and he considered which of two possibilities was more unsettling, that she had known about the pre-composed message before he arrived, or that she had not needed to. He told her he wanted a demonstration, 1,000 meters, the extended range facility, 0532 mornings from now. She told him professionally and without hostility that demonstrations created visibility, and visibility degraded operational effectiveness. She told him this not to argue, but because it was accurate, and she gave accurate information to people who needed it, even when they were going to disregard it. He told her he was not requesting her professional opinion on the matter. She told him it was crystal clear. 2 words. Then she returned to the cleaning mat and the rifle, and the work that had been interrupted, and Harwell and Voss walked out of the armory into the Arizona morning, and the sound of 30 soldiers releasing held breath was almost audible in their wake. Carver did not watch them go. She did not need to. She was already calculating variables for a 1,000-meter demonstration in late August Arizona conditions. Wind patterns at this elevation, sunrise temperature gradient, atmospheric pressure trend. 1,000 meters was a qualification distance. She had been making that shot since she was 21 years old. The demonstration would go fine. The problem was not 1,000 meters. The problem was what happened after. She finished the bolt carrier group inspection and set it down. She picked up her secure phone. The message she typed was brief and factual, the way she made everything. Surfaced. Harwell noticed the badge, awaiting protocol. She sent it to a number that did not appear in any directory Voss would have access to, then pocketed the phone and went back to the Barrett. What no one in the armory knew was that she had received a reply within 90 seconds. Maintain position. Continue observation. Do not initiate contact. She read it once, deleted it, and continued cleaning. The ritual was almost complete. She reassembled the Barrett with the same deliberate precision she had used to disassemble it, each component returning to its place in the sequence her hands had performed so many hundreds of times they did not require conscious instruction. The sound of the rifle going back together was a series of quiet mechanical confirmations, each one meaning exactly what it was supposed to mean. Nothing loose, nothing out of tolerance, nothing that would fail. She worked, and what she thought about during the reassembly was what she always thought about. Not Harwell, not the demonstration, not the message from a number with no name attached to it. She thought about the things she had been thinking about during this specific ritual for 6 years without ever saying it out loud to anyone, except once very briefly to a retired colonel named Aldous Fenn, who had understood without requiring her to finish the sentence. She thought about a backyard in Montana, a sunset that turned the whole sky orange and red above the mountains, a young man in army dress uniform who had been dead for 11 years. Specialist Daniel Carver had been 22 years old when he deployed to Kandahar with the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, and 22 years old when he did not come back. The Army's letter used the word fallen, which Lena had always thought was imprecise. He was not fallen. he was killed. He was killed by a man with a rifle at a distance of 800 meters, and nobody on his team had the capability to answer at that range. And so the distance went unanswered, and Daniel Carver came home in a box with a flag on top of it to a house in rural Montana, where his 17-year-old sister received the news with a stillness so complete that the casualty notification officer later noted in his report that the family member appeared to be in shock. She had not been in shock. She had been making a decision, not in words. She had not stood in that doorway and thought a specific sentence about what she was going to do with the rest of her life. It had been more like the closing of a door. The quiet, definitive closing of a door that had been standing open, and behind that door had been a version of her life that looked like other people's lives, and when the door closed, she was standing in a hallway that led somewhere else entirely. She spent 2 years after that day learning everything she could without the Army's resources. She read physics textbooks and ballistics manuals and everything available about the technical side of long-range marksmanship. She drove 45 minutes to a rifle range every weekend and shot until the range closed. She was not the best shot there on her first visit. She was the best shot there by her 3rd month. She enlisted at 20. She was assigned to the 10th Mountain Division. 14 months into her service, a man she would come to know as Colonel Aldous Fenn watched her qualify on the M110 sniper system at 1,200 meters and made a phone call that same afternoon. 3 weeks later, she was on a plane to a training location that appeared in her orders only as a number and a grid coordinate, where she spent 2 years learning things the Army did not teach anyone. Fenn had said to her on the first day of that program, while 11 other candidates were still standing in the same room, most of you will be excellent, and it will not be enough. She had thought about Daniel. She had thought then, I will be more than excellent. The Barrett was fully reassembled. She ran her hands along the receiver in the final check, not because she doubted the assembly, but because the ritual was not complete until she had. Everything was right. Everything was where it belonged. She signed the weapon custody log, collected her cleaning gear, and secured the Barrett in the arms room. She walked out of the armory into the August Arizona sun, which hit her the way it always did, like something that had made a decision about you before you arrived. The temperature was 91 degrees and climbing. She started planning for the demonstration. She did not think about the 4-minute and 17-second timestamp on a message that should not have existed yet, or about what it meant that someone had watched the armory closely enough to anticipate her being noticed before the noticing happened. She thought about wind and distance and the first light of an Arizona morning. She thought about what she was going to show a 3-star general at 1,000 meters, and more precisely, what she was going to make sure he understood she was not showing him. Colonel Aldous Fenn arrived at Camp Ridgeway at 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before he was expected, which was exactly how he had operated for 40 years in a profession where being early was not courtesy, but survival. His truck was a Ford F-250 that had seen the better part of 3 decades and made no apologies for it. The paint was desert faded along the hood, and the rear panels carried the dents of a vehicle driven on roads that did not appear on maps. He parked it in the visitor lot with the care of a man who aligned things correctly because he could not tolerate the alternative. General Marcus Harwell was waiting in his office with 2 cups of coffee already poured. Good coffee, not the motor oil from the headquarters break room. Fenn walked in, looked at the cups, nodded once, and sat down across the desk with the unhurried ease of a man who had sat across from generals often enough that the furniture arrangement no longer carried any particular weight. He was 68 years old. His face had been shaped by decades outdoors in conditions that extracted a price from skin and eyes. White hair cut close. Pale gray eyes that absorbed a room completely and without apparent effort. He had retired from active service 7 years ago and spent the time since doing consulting work whose specific nature he declined to discuss in any room that was not certified secure. Harwell laid out what he had found. The badge, the armory, the questions Carver had answered, and the larger questions her answers had raised. The 87% classification. The message from Victoria Sloan and its impossible timestamp. Fenn listened to all of it without interrupting, both hands around his coffee cup, his expression moving through a sequence that ended somewhere near tired recognition. When Harwell finished, Fenn was quiet long enough for the air conditioning to become audible. Then he said, I trained her myself. From 2016 to 2018. She was 20 years old when she walked into the program, and she was already the best natural marksman I had seen in 4 decades of teaching people to shoot at distance. He set the cup down. I tested 47 candidates over 20 years. 12 of them graduated. Lena is the best of those 12, possibly the best precision marksman this country has ever produced. And I say that as a man who has analyzed the ballistics of every confirmed long-range combat kill in the past 30 years, including the Canadian shot in 2017. That shot was remarkable. What Lena does operationally is beyond remarkable. It is in a category that does not have an established name. Harwell asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the previous morning. Is the badge accurate? Every word of it, Fenn said. Syria, 2023. The target was a weapons engineer with documented connections to multiple regional attack networks. Carver was the only asset in position to interdict within the operational window. She made the shot from a mountain ridge at 3,247 meters. Confirmed kill. The engagement prevented a coordinated attack on civilian infrastructure. Estimated lives protected based on post-mission intelligence assessment somewhere between 4 and 600. He said it the way a man reported weather. Not because he was indifferent to the weight of it, because he had learned over 20 years that the weight had to go somewhere, and the place he had chosen to put it was a careful and precise accounting that honored what had happened by describing it accurately. The world record is 3540, Harwell said. I know, I was consulted on that shot. The Canadian engagement had near-ideal conditions. Steady wind, good visibility. Target stationary for an extended period. 8 hours of setup time. It was a magnificent piece of work. Fenn looked at the surface of his coffee. Lena's shot was made in variable wind with a 4-hour setup window and a target that was stationary for 90 seconds. From a technical standpoint, what she did in Syria was harder than the shot that holds the world record. It will never appear in any record book because no American personnel were officially operating in that region during that period. Harwell absorbed this. He had spent 27 years in an institution that ran on documentation and hierarchy and the written confirmation of things that had happened. He understood at a theoretical level that there were operations which occurred outside that structure. He had authorized some himself. But sitting across from a retired colonel describing a combat action that exceeded the limits of what he had believed human beings were capable of delivered with the calm certainty of a man reporting personally verified facts, he felt something shift in his understanding of the institution he had devoted his adult life to. He told Fenn about the demonstration. 1,000 meters, 0530 the following morning. Fenn nodded slowly. She won't be comfortable with it, I know. She said so. What she said and what she means are rarely identical, Fenn said. When Lena objects on operational grounds, she is usually right. When she objects on personal grounds, she usually says nothing at all. The fact that she articulated the objection tells you she was genuinely concerned. The fact that she accepted the order tells you she calculated the cost was manageable. He picked up his coffee again. She has been calculating costs her entire adult life, Marcus. It is what she does instead of worrying. There was something in the way he said it, not pride exactly, something older and quieter. The particular regard of someone who had watched a person become something extraordinary and understood with complete clarity what that process had actually extracted from everything adjacent to it. Harwell asked the question that Fenn's tone had opened. What else is in her record that I have not seen? Fenn was quiet for a moment. Then he made a decision that was visible in the slight forward movement of his shoulders, the posture of a man committing to a direction. Afghanistan, he said, November 2022. A vehicle-borne explosive device was identified by surveillance assets at a distance that put it outside the effective engagement range of everything the forward operating base had available except one option. Lena was in position on an elevated observation post approximately 3,380 meters from the vehicle's projected intercept point. He stopped. She made the shot, Harwell said. She made the shot. The vehicle was disabled at distance. The base was protected. Casualty count from the incident 0. From a mission standpoint, complete success. The silence in the office had a specific texture now. Harwell asked, but during the exfiltration from the observation post, she was engaged by a secondary element that had moved into the valley during her setup period. She took a round in the left shoulder. Not immediately incapacitating. Serious. Fenn met Harwell's eyes directly. She made the 3,380-meter shot after she had already been hit, Marcus. She was bleeding when she pulled the trigger. The medical officer at the base documented the wound when she arrived at the aid station 40 minutes later and asked her when it had occurred. She told him it happened during exfil. That was technically accurate. It happened during the exfiltration phase of the operation, which included the time she spent in the observation post completing the mission before she moved. Harwell set his coffee cup down carefully. No one knows, Fenn said. She did not report the full sequence. I know because she told me afterward, not in a debrief, but in a phone call, at 11 at night when I could hear in her voice that she had been sitting with it for a while and needed to say it to someone who would understand without requiring her to explain everything from the beginning. If it had been in the official record, the program would have been placed under review. An operator completing an extreme range engagement while actively wounded raises liability and assessment questions that take months to resolve. She knew that. She made a decision about what to report and what to allow to remain in the sequence of events as documented. He paused. She protected the program, at personal cost, as she does most things. The morning light had shifted while they talked, moving across the floor of Harwell's office, in the particular way Arizona light moved, direct and unambiguous. Outside, Camp Ridgeway was fully awake. The sounds of a military installation conducting its morning operations came through the walls with the comfortable familiarity of routine. Harwell thought about a woman in a corner of his armory, working in the dark at 5:45 in the morning, taking apart a rifle that weighed nearly 30 pounds with the focused calm of someone for whom the work itself was the sustaining thing. He thought about what the work was actually doing. He thought he was beginning to understand. The extended range facility sat at the northern edge of Camp Ridgeway's footprint, where the installation gave way to open desert that ran flat for several miles before the terrain began to rise toward distant ridgelines. The firing positions faced north, elevated slightly above the valley floor. In good conditions, the facility could accommodate targets at 1,500 meters. When Carver arrived at 0400 to begin her setup, it was empty, except for the range safety officer, Sergeant Major Briggs, who had been running this facility for 11 years. He watched her work for 2 hours before anyone else arrived, standing at a discreet distance with his morning coffee, observing the process with the detached appreciation of someone who had been a designated marksman himself for 16 years before administrative duties overtook the operational. He had seen every kind of shooting demonstration that passed through Camp Ridgeway. He had not seen anything quite like this. The weather balloons went up at 30-minute intervals. She tracked each one with binoculars and made notes in a weatherproof notebook with writing so small and precise it looked mechanical. She used 3 separate laser rangefinders to measure the distance to the target position, triangulating the readings, comparing them against each other and against her own calculations before accepting a final number. She tested soil moisture at the firing position. She measured temperature at ground level and at 6 feet. She recorded barometric pressure and noted its rate of change over the preceding 90 minutes. She did not use the ballistic computer that sat in the open case beside her equipment. Briggs, who had watched many soldiers rely heavily on ballistic computers, noted this and said nothing. Harwell arrived at 0510 with Fenn beside him and Voss 3 steps behind. Colonel Richards, Camp Ridgeway's commanding officer, came 2 minutes later with the slightly compressed expression of a man who had agreed to be present at something he was not entirely certain he understood. The group settled into the observation position. Voss had arranged far enough from the firing line to give Carver space close enough to see everything. Fenn moved to the spotting scope. The sky to the east was moving from black to the deep violet that preceded actual light. The temperature was 63 degrees, dropping slightly, the way desert temperatures did in the last hour before sunrise. One final cold breath before the furnace restarted. The range flags hung almost still. Almost. At 0540, the wind arrived. It came from the west as forecast, building from nothing to a consistent 12 miles per hour in under 3 minutes. And the flags that had been barely moving became flags that knew exactly what they were for. Carver's attention shifted. She released another balloon, tracked it with a focus that had a physical quality, like something with edges, and made 2 additional notations. Then she settled behind the Barrett. There was no visible moment of transition. She settled into the rifle, and the settling itself changed her. The separate components of a person in space, the small movements and micro-adjustments, and the ambient evidence of a body managing itself, all of it condensed into something unified and absolutely still. Her breathing slowed to the pace of someone almost asleep. Her hands, which had been moving continuously for 2 hours, came to rest and simply rested. Fenn began calling data from the spotting scope in a low, even voice. Wind 12 steady, gusting to 16 right to left. Temperature 74 at target zone. Humidity 41. Pressure stable. Carver's voice came back without inflection. Confirmed. Computing. She did not touch the ballistic computer. Harwell watched her. He had commanded thousands of soldiers. He had seen elite units perform under pressure in conditions that tested everything a human being was capable of. He had seen courage and skill and the particular grace that sometimes emerged when training and instinct aligned completely. He had not seen this before. This specific quality of concentration, as if everything that was not directly relevant to the next 30 seconds had been carefully set aside, and what remained was simply the task and the person performing it, with nothing between them. The wind gusted to 16. Carver did not move. It dropped back to 12. 90 seconds of silence. Fenn said quietly, "Window." The Barrett fired. The sound was a physical event. Even with hearing protection, Harwell felt the concussion in his sternum. The muzzle brake redirected the blast in a pattern that lifted dust from the ground in a perfect, expanding circle. The rifle moved back into Carver's shoulder with a force that could not be argued with, and she received it the way a deeply rooted tree receives wind, not by resisting, but by having mass and structure that absorbed rather than opposed. Fenn's eyes stayed on the spotting scope. Impact, center mass, zero deviation. Briggs confirmed it in the flat voice of a man who spent 11 years on this range and had learned not to overstate things. Dead center, perfect shot. The silence that followed lasted almost 10 seconds. Richard spoke first. He said he had been in the military for 28 years and had never seen anything like it. Fenn said nothing. He had seen Lena Carver shoot before. What he had just witnessed was routine for her, and he knew what routine felt like when you had been watching someone long enough. Harwell walked to where Carver was beginning to clear her weapon. He told her it was exceptional. She told him it was 78% probability given the wind conditions. Not exceptional, probable. He said she had made it look easy. She looked at him directly for the first time since the previous morning, and he saw something in her green eyes that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who had heard an inaccuracy and was deciding whether the correction was worth the effort. She told him it was physics and probability management. She had waited for the moment when the variables aligned closely enough that success became more likely than failure. That was the job. Not remarkable skill, though skill mattered. Not perfect equipment, though equipment mattered. Patience until the moment arrived when the variables allowed a probable outcome instead of merely a possible one. Then she returned to breaking down her equipment, and Harwell stood watching her, and Fenn came to stand beside him, and the two men observed in silence until Fenn said quietly, so that only Harwell could hear, "Now imagine 3 times the distance, Marcus. Now imagine the bullet in flight for 7 seconds while the wind does whatever wind decides to do." Harwell was still imagining it when the range facility door opened and Victoria Sloan walked in. She was 50 years old and dressed in civilian clothes the color of slate, no rank insignia, no agency identification visible. She moved with the compressed efficiency of someone who had spent decades in environments where efficiency was not preference but necessity. Dark hair pulled back, a face that made its expressions a deliberate choice rather than a reflex. She had not come from Phoenix. She had not driven. The helicopter that brought her from the airfield 12 miles east had already departed. She walked directly to Harwell. She said, "General, we need to speak privately." He took her to the small operations room at the back of the range facility. Fenn remained outside with the others. Carver continued breaking down her equipment with the deliberateness of someone whose focus extended no further than the immediate task. Inside the operations room, Sloan did not sit down. She told Harwell what he had done, not in the language of accusation, but in the language of consequence. Every person who had witnessed that demonstration was a potential information channel. Channels leaked. Channels were exploited. A strategic asset's value was a direct function of what adversaries did not know about it, and what had just happened on this range had expanded the universe of people who knew something they were not supposed to know. She told him she was ordering Carver's transfer, classified destination, within 24 hours. Harwell asked her where. She told him that was not information he required. He was quiet for a moment. 27 years of institutional reflex told him to absorb direction from someone operating with authority above his and move accordingly. 3 decades of learning how things actually worked inside the structure told him something else. Directors of special access programs did not fly to Arizona in person to deliver transfer orders that could have been handled through secure electronic means. They came in person when there was something they needed to observe or control that could not be managed remotely. He asked her why she had come herself. Something shifted behind Sloan's eyes. A brief recalculation of the person across from her. She told him the program was under congressional review. Budget reallocation. The kind of review that ended with a funding line disappearing and a capability that had taken 20 years to develop being quietly archived. Carver was the last active asset. If the program's final operator was lost to exposure or compromise, the review board would have exactly the kind of documented failure that made permanent defunding a straightforward decision. Harwell said, "So you came to make sure the order was executed?" She said, "I came to make sure you understood what was at stake." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Understood." He did not say he would sign the transfer order. She heard the difference. They returned to the range floor. Carver's equipment was packed. The Barrett was in its case. She stood at the edge of the firing line, looking north across the desert valley with an expression that revealed nothing. The absence of expression on her face was not blankness, it was discipline. Anything underneath it was entirely her own. Then Voss's tablet chimed with a priority notification bearing a classification header Harwell had seen fewer than 10 times in his career. Voss read it. His face changed. He looked at Harwell. "Sir, there is a situation." The briefing came through encrypted channels and fragments that assembled themselves into a picture Harwell had not wanted to see on a Tuesday morning in August. Rattlesnake Ridge Border Monitoring Station sat in a natural canyon system 43 miles south of Camp Ridgeway, close enough to the border to hear sounds from the other side on a quiet night. A hardened facility, concrete and steel, equipped with surveillance systems monitoring several hundred square miles of terrain. 8 Border Patrol agents and 3 civilian contractors who maintained the surveillance equipment had been inside when the facility was seized at 0300 hours. 11 people. The group holding them had made contact with federal authorities at 0430. $5 million. Helicopter transport to a destination across the border. An 8-hour deadline after which one hostage would be executed every hour until demands were met. They had already detonated an improvised device in the facility's vehicle bay to demonstrate both capability and seriousness. The FBI's hostage rescue team was staging 2 hours away. Their tactical assessment had been transmitted with the briefing. Harwell read the relevant section twice. Direct assault, 70% probability of casualties among the hostage population. Canyon terrain provides natural observation advantage to occupying force. All approach vectors identifiable at sufficient distance to allow defensive preparation. 70%. In a hostage situation, 70% casualty probability was not a tactical option. It was a catastrophe with a plan attached to it. The group's leader had been identified through the facility's external cameras. Garrison Tholt, 41 years old. Formerly Staff Sergeant Garrison Tholt, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta United States Army, discharged under other than honorable conditions in 2017 following an investigation into conduct during a classified operation that had generated significant questions and a shortage of satisfactory answers. He had disappeared from every trackable database for 8 months after his discharge. When he resurfaced, he was affiliated with a transnational criminal organization that moved things across borders that were not supposed to cross borders. His call sign was Wraith. The Army had trained him. The Army had given him precisely the expertise that made him dangerous, and then the Army had discharged him in a way that left the expertise intact in the institutional loyalty in pieces. He knew how federal law enforcement responded to hostage situations. He knew how tactical teams staged and approached and communicated. He had helped write portions of the playbook. Then the intelligence addendum arrived, and the picture changed entirely. Overhead drone surveillance of the canyon system, initiated within 30 minutes of the seizure, had identified 2 positions on the ridgelines surrounding the facility. Both contained personnel equipped with long-range rifle systems. Thermal signatures consistent with suppressed .338 Lapua Magnum platforms. Both positions had clear sightlines to the 3 most probable approach corridors for any ground element moving toward the facility. Tholt had anticipated a precision interdiction response. He had placed counter-sniper assets at distances that covered every conventional firing position within practical range. He was waiting for exactly the kind of response that was being considered. Any attempt to use a standard sniper element would expose that element to direct fire from positions they could not see. This was not a hostage situation. It was a trap built to look like a hostage situation, and the bait was 11 people who had been in the wrong place at 0300 in the morning. Fenn read the addendum. He looked up from the tablet with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years thinking about geometry and distance and the particular mathematics of who could reach whom from where. He looked at Carver. She had positioned herself beside Voss without announcing herself, and no one had told her to step back because no one in the room was entirely certain what authority applied to her in this specific moment. She was looking at the topographic overlay of the canyon system. Her eyes moved across it the way eyes move through a scope, not scanning, but moving from one significant point to the next with the directness of someone confirming what they had already concluded. She put her finger on the map. Here, the ridge she was indicating sat at the northern edge of the canyon system above both counter-sniper positions with a clear downward angle into the facility's courtyard. Voss pulled the range calculation. The number came back, and he said it in the voice of a man not entirely certain he was reading it correctly. 3,470 meters, 90 meters beyond Syria, 140 meters beyond Afghanistan. 370 meters beyond any confirmed combat kill in the documented history of American military operations. Sloan said the probability of a successful engagement at that distance, under field conditions, with the time constraints of this situation does not meet the threshold required to justify exposing the program's capability. We should allow HRT to execute their assessment with full understanding of the risks involved. She was not wrong. She was also not the person who had to live with the number 70%. Harwell looked at Carver. Sergeant, your assessment. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty, the quiet of a person running a calculation that required silence to complete itself. 19%, she said. Maybe 22 if conditions optimized during the firing window. That is my honest probability assessment for a confirmed hit on a moving target at 3470 under variable wind and heat with a 6-hour setup maximum. Sloan said 19% is not a viable basis for a mission decision. Carver looked at her. 19% is better than 0, she said, and it is considerably better than the 30% survival odds the current alternative offers 11 people who are sitting in that facility right now, waiting for the next several hours to determine whether they go home. She looked back at the map. Tholt's counter-snipers are positioned for anything within 2,000 meters. Anything beyond that falls outside their threat model. He was trained by this institution. He knows the doctrine. He does not believe anyone can do this at 3470 under field conditions because nothing in his training told him it was possible. That disbelief is the only approach vector that does not have someone waiting at the end of it. She paused. My brother's team had no answer at 800 meters. These 11 people deserve an answer. The room was very quiet. Then she said in exactly the same tone she used for everything wheels up in 20 minutes. Sloan looked at Harwell. Harwell looked at the map for a moment, and then he told Voss to get the helicopter ready. Sloan boarded without being asked. Harwell had expected her to object. She did not. She simply got on and strapped in and looked out the window at Camp Ridgeway, receding below as the rotors beat the August air into submission. In the seat across from her, Carver was looking at the topographic map on a tablet, her lips moving very slightly with the silent language of a person calculating something that had no margin for error. The desert moved below them, brown and absolute. 11 people were waiting in a canyon 43 miles south inside a building surrounded by men who understood the playbook and had built their position specifically to counter anyone who played by its rules. Carver understood that too. She had stopped operating within the standard playbook approximately 6 years ago when she first understood that the playbook had been written for distances she had already left behind. The helicopter banked south. She closed her eyes and finished the calculations she had started in the operations room. When she opened them, she knew where the shot was. She did not yet know whether the variables would cooperate. That was the job. That had always been the job. The ridge was exactly what the topographic map had promised and nothing more. No shade, no protection from the wind that moved across the elevated terrain with the indifferent persistence of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years and would continue for 10,000 years after everyone currently standing on it was gone. The rock beneath the position was pale sandstone sun-bleached and fractured, radiating the heat it had been absorbing since dawn back into the air in waves that made the distant canyon floor shimmer like something seen through disturbed water. Carver had the Barrett assembled before the helicopter's rotors had fully stopped. She moved from the landing zone to the firing position at a pace that looked unhurried and covered ground faster than it appeared to. Harwell had watched her move in the armory and the range facility across the pavement of Camp Ridgeway's compound, and he had noted each time the same essential quality, economy, the absolute absence of wasted motion, a body that had learned to spend itself precisely because it understood that there was always a cost, the cost always came due, and the only question was whether you had managed it well enough to be functional when the moment required it. She settled into the position she had identified from satellite imagery on the helicopter, a slight depression in the ridgeline providing a stable platform without the elevation penalty of a fully exposed crest. She oriented the Barrett toward a canyon system visible in the middle distance as a darkening of the terrain, a place where the desert floor dropped into shadow. Fenn set up the spotting scope 30 feet to her left. Harwell took a position behind and slightly right of the firing line, close enough to observe, far enough to be irrelevant to what was happening. Voss positioned himself beside him with the satellite phone connecting them to the Tactical Operations Center to HRT, staging 2 miles north to the drone, circling overhead, with a continuous feed of the facility's courtyard and the surrounding terrain. Sloan stood 10 feet behind Fenn. She had not spoken since the helicopter. The thermometer on Voss's equipment pack read 97 degrees at 1:14 in the afternoon. The sun came down on the ridge with the directness of something that had made a decision about this place long before anyone arrived. Within 10 minutes, Harwell's uniform was soaked through across the back and shoulders. He did not move to address it. He watched Carver and stayed still. She released the first weather balloon at 1:22, holding the string as it rose and tracking its drift with her binoculars, watching it move northeast and slightly upward as the thermal currents above the canyon system carried it away from the ridge. She made notations in the weatherproof notebook, numbers and abbreviations that meant specific things to her and to Fenn and would have meant nothing to anyone else on this ridge. The second balloon went up 30 minutes later. The third at 2:30. Between balloons, she used the laser rangefinders, all three triangulating the distance to the target area in the facility's courtyard with the methodical repetition of a person who understood that a single measurement was a data point and three measurements were the beginning of a fact. She reconciled the slightly different readings through a process that was neither averaging nor discarding, but something more nuanced, a weighting based on the specific atmospheric conditions between the ridge and the target at the moment each reading was taken. She did not use the ballistic computer. Fenn confirmed this without being asked, speaking quietly in the direction of the ground between himself and Harwell. At this distance, he said, atmospheric modeling breaks down at the edges of what the software was designed for. You need someone who can integrate real-time sensory data with calculated projections and update the firing solution as conditions change. A computer does the math it was given. She does math that has not been written down yet. The satellite phone provided updates from the Tactical Operations Center at intervals that grew shorter as the afternoon progressed and the deadline approached. The hostages had been moved to the facility's main courtyard at noon, visible to overhead surveillance, a demonstration that Tholt controlled the situation and had no concern about letting everyone see exactly what was at stake. Tholt himself had been observed in the courtyard 4 times between noon and 2:30. Each appearance lasted between 6 and 11 seconds. He moved to the northwest corner where the canyon walls provided the best radio signal, made contact with his external elements, and withdrew. The pattern was not regular enough to be predicted with confidence. It was regular enough to be anticipated with patience. The counter-sniper positions on the eastern and western ridgelines had not moved. Both were within 1,500 meters of the facility, both oriented toward the southern and northern approach corridors. They were waiting for something to come from below. Nothing was going to come from below. At 3:12, Voss received a transmission from HRT's commander at the staging area. He listened. He turned to Harwell with the expression of a man delivering information he would have preferred not to deliver. They are requesting a status update, sir. If there is no engagement opportunity in the next 90 minutes, they are recommending transition to direct assault. Their position is that the probability calculus changes if the deadline passes and Tholt begins executing hostages. Harwell looked at Carver. She had not paused. She was releasing her 4th weather balloon, watching it rise through the superheated air above the canyon, her binoculars tracking its drift with the same focused attention she had given the first 3. She had been on this ridge for 2 hours and looked exactly as she had when she arrived. No visible fatigue, no visible stress, no acknowledgement of the deadline, the counter-snipers, the narrowing window, or the 11 people in the courtyard below. Harwell told Voss to inform HRT they were continuing to develop the engagement opportunity and would communicate any change in status immediately. He then moved to stand near Sloan. He asked her quietly the question that had been sitting in him since the operations room at Camp Ridgeway. You knew something like this was coming. Not this specifically, but something in this region. The intelligence forecast. She kept her binoculars up. We had indicators of elevated activity in this corridor for 6 weeks, she said. Nothing specific enough to generate a preventive operation. Enough to suggest that assets with particular capabilities should not be positioned in the immediate area. He let that settle. The transfer order, he said, was intended to move her out of the region before something like this materialized, Sloan said, and created exactly the scenario we are currently in, where the only viable option requires exposing a capability whose value is directly proportional to its remaining unknown. She lowered the binoculars and looked at him. You ordered the demonstration general. You kept her at Camp Ridgeway for 48 additional hours because you needed to understand what she was. I understand that impulse. It is a reasonable impulse for a man in your position. But those 48 hours are the reason we are standing on this ridge right now instead of having this conversation somewhere else entirely. Harwell received this without deflecting it. He thought about what Fenn had told him that morning, about cost, about the way Lena Carver managed it. He thought about his own 48 hours of curiosity and what they had actually cost not him, but the 11 people sitting in a courtyard in 97-degree heat, waiting for the next several hours to determine whether they went home. He did not apologize to Sloan because an apology at this point was a luxury the situation could not accommodate. He turned back toward the firing line and resumed his position, and the afternoon continued its slow and merciless progress. At 3:47, the wind changed. Harwell felt it before he consciously registered it, a reduction in the irregular gusting that had been intermittently spiking to 20 miles per hour since 1:30. The flags Carver had placed at intervals down the ridge stopped their violent snapping and settled into a steadier rhythm. 14 miles per hour, 13. The variability was not gone, but it was reduced the way a rough sea sometimes found a temporary cadence between swells. Carver's posture changed. It was almost nothing, a slight increase in a tension that was already nearly invisible. The posture of a coiled spring that had received the final increment of force required to reach maximum potential. She released one more balloon, tracked it for 90 seconds, made a single notation in her notebook. Then she closed the notebook, set it down, and did not reach for it again. Fenn settled behind the spotting scope with the focused economy of a man who had done this for 40 years and had learned to bring everything he had to the moment without ceremony. Primary target not visible, he said. Northwest corner position, empty. Courtyard occupied by 4 secondary elements and 11 hostages. Northwest corner, clear. Carver said, confirmed. Then she settled behind the Barrett. The settling was different from the range facility. At 1,000 meters that morning, there had been a technical quality to it, the precise preparation of a professional for a task well within her capabilities. What happened now, at 3,470 meters in 97-degree heat, with the wind moving across the canyon in patterns that could not be fully anticipated, was something else. Something that did not have a precise technical name, but that Harwell, watching it, understood with the wordless clarity of a man who had spent his life in the presence of human beings, operating at the absolute limit of what they were. She was not preparing. She was becoming. The internal architecture that made it possible to do what she was about to attempt, the metabolic control, the respiratory compression, the absolute centralization of every cognitive and physical resource toward a single point in space, 3.5 kilometers away, that architecture was not something you assembled when you needed it. It was something you maintained continuously at significant personal cost through years of practice and discipline that extracted a price from everything adjacent to it. The ordinariness of her daily existence, the corner of the armory, the ritual maintenance, the minimal conversation, the careful management of visibility, all of it was the container that held this capacity. This was what the container was for. Fenn called the data in a voice that had dropped to just above a whisper, precise and flat technical vocabulary, translating the physical world into numbers. 113 right to left. Steady. Temperature 96 at shooter position, 94 at target zone. Humidity 38. Pressure 29.91 stable. Mirage moderate northwest to southeast. Carver's breathing was no longer visible from Harwell's position. Her heart rate, he understood from everything Fenn had told him, was in the low 40s. Not by design, not as an achieved goal, but as a consequence of a decade of physiological adaptation to a practice that required the body to operate at a level of stillness that most human nervous systems had no framework for reaching. Fenn's voice even quieter now. Primary target, northwest position, moving. Through his binoculars, Harwell watched Garrison Tholtz step into the courtyard corner. The man was a shape at this distance, heat, shimmer, and shadow. A human figure reduced to its essential geometry by 3.5 kilometers of superheated desert air. He had a radio in his hand. He was making contact with his external elements, as he had done 4 times before, as Carver had predicted he would do, because the terrain logic of the canyon left him no better option, and he did not know there was a position above him that had not been accounted for in his operational planning. He was stationary. Fenn counted quietly. 1, 2, 3. The wind held at 13, 4, 5. Carver's finger rested on the trigger with exactly the contact pressure she had described in the armory. Enough for control, not enough to disturb anything. 6. In the 7 seconds that followed, the Earth rotated approximately 1/100th of a degree on its axis. The bullet, when it left the barrel, would travel fast enough to cover the distance before a person could count to 8, but not fast enough to ignore the fact that the planet beneath it was in motion. Carver had accounted for this. She had accounted for everything that could be accounted for, and she had accepted with the same quiet precision she brought to every variable that there were things which could not be fully accounted for, and that this was not a reason to not take the shot. It was a reason to wait for the moment when the unaccountable portion was at its minimum. 7. The Barrett fired. The sound was the sound of something final. Not simply violent, though it was that too. Final in the way that certain sounds were final, the closing of a door at the end of a long corridor, the last word of a sentence that had been building for a very long time. The muzzle brake redirected the blast in its characteristic expanding circle, lifting pale dust from the sandstone. The rifle moved into Carver's shoulder with a force that would have knocked an unprepared person backward, and she received it the way she received everything, not by resisting, but by having already incorporated it into the physics of the moment, having made it part of the calculation rather than a surprise. 7 seconds. The bullet crossed 3,470 meters of desert air, navigating a route calculated in a human mind, not in a computer, not in a manual, in a mind that had spent 8 years becoming capable of this specific calculation in these specific conditions. 7 seconds of distance and wind and the rotation of the earth beneath everything. And then Garrison Tholt was no longer standing. He went down the way a structure went down, when the load-bearing element was suddenly gone completely, and instantaneously the architecture of a body returning to the earth without the organizing principle that had held it upright. Fenn's voice. Impact. Target down. Confirmed. On the overhead drone feed, Voss reported it in short factual bursts. 3 secondary elements dropping weapons. Hands raised. 4th element moving west toward the perimeter. HRT is engaging. Hostages, mobile. Hostages upright and moving toward the south wall. Then all 11 hostages accounted for. HRT has control of the courtyard. Facility secure. He stopped. The ridge was very quiet. Harwell stood and looked at the canyon system in the middle distance and felt something that was not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. The specific sensation of a calculation resolving, of a number that had been wrong becoming right. 70% casualty probability had become 0. 11 people who had been sitting in a courtyard waiting for the next 8 hours to determine whether they went home or did not were going home. 1 bullet, 7 seconds, 3.5 kilometers. He turned to look at Carver. She was clearing the Barrett with the same ritual precision she applied to everything. Her hands moved through the process without hurry or drama. She cleared the chamber. She engaged the safety. She continued until the weapon was safe for transport. Then she sat back from the rifle for the first time in nearly 3 hours, and she reached for her canteen and she poured the remaining water over her head, and she let it run down her face and neck and soak into the collar of her uniform. It was the only evidence that the 97-degree heat had touched her at all. Fenn came to kneel beside her. He handed her a second water bottle from his pack, and she drank half of it in one continuous motion. When he spoke, his voice had a quality Harwell had not heard in it before. Not the professional precision of the instructor or the technical expert, something older and quieter than that. 3470, he said. Variable wind, extreme heat, a 9-second firing window. That is the longest confirmed combat kill in the history of this country, Lena. In the history of any country that anyone alive will know about. She looked at him. 11 people are going home tonight, she said. That is the only number I am keeping. He nodded once. That is the correct number, he said. She went back to clearing her weapon. The helicopter carried fewer words on the return flight than the one that had come south. Sloan sat in and looked out the window at the desert moving below her. She made one phone call from the ridge before the helicopter arrived, brief and inaudible to anyone else on the ridgeline. Harwell had watched her make it and had not tried to hear it. He knew what the call was. The transfer order was being revised, not canceled, revised. What happened after that would be decided in rooms in Northern Virginia that Harwell would never be invited to enter. He looked at Carver across the cargo bay. She was looking at the middle distance with the focused absence of a person whose mind was processing something that required silence to complete itself. In the final 20 minutes on the ridge, after the equipment was packed and before the helicopter arrived, he had watched her close her eyes and slow her breathing into the slightly reduced rhythm he had come to associate with her deliberate states. He understood now that she had been putting things back, the same way she put rifle components back in their designated positions after cleaning. The careful, deliberate reassembly of the architecture that made it possible to function. The architecture that an extreme-range engagement required her to fully deploy, and that she then had to rebuild afterward because it was also the architecture of her daily life, the cost that Fenn had spoken of. This was what it looked like from the outside. The helicopter banked north and Camp Ridgeway appeared on the horizon, angular and certain against the desert. The armory was empty when they arrived. It was past 4:30, and the afternoon soldiers had come and gone conducting their business and departing for evening formation. The fluorescent lights were on their automatic evening cycle 1 and 3, active, the floor polished and quiet. The corner was empty. Carver went to it the way she always went to it. Without announcement or ceremony, setting her equipment case down and opening the Barrett case and beginning the disassembly, the day required that something in her required which had no name, but whose absence would have been a kind of disorder she could not afford. Harwell followed her in. He stood at the edge of the space she occupied and watched her hands move through the components and did not speak for a while. Fenn had stayed outside, had shaken Harwell's hand at the armory door with the grip of a man who had said everything he needed to say and did not require further conversation to confirm it. When Harwell spoke, he did not speak in the language of rank or command or official record. He told her that what she had done today would never appear in any official account, that no ceremony would mark it, that no report of what happened at Rattlesnake Ridge made available to the public would ever contain her name or her presence or the specific fact of a bullet crossing 3.5 kilometers of desert air to end a crisis that was otherwise going to end very differently. He told her he understood that. He told her he had witnessed it anyway. She did not look up from the bolt carrier group. He said, "Your brother, 2013, Kandahar." It was not a question. She set down the cleaning rod. Her hands were still on the mat. She looked at the component in front of her, 800 meters, she said. Nobody on his team had an answer. He waited. She said, "I have spent 8 years making sure it is never 800 meters again. For anyone." It was the longest statement she had made about herself in any conversation Harwell had been part of since he first noticed her badge 3 mornings ago in the same armory. He received it the way you receive something that had been carried a long distance and offered without expectation of a specific response. Not with sympathy, which would have been inadequate. Not with professional acknowledgement, which would have been insufficient. With a simple recognition of one person understanding another. He said, "That is what the badge means." She picked up the cleaning rod. "The badge is a number," she said. "The number is accurate. The number is not the point." She resumed cleaning. He stayed for several more minutes, not speaking, simply present. Then he turned and walked out into the long Arizona evening, where the sun was making its final approach to the western horizon, and the desert was doing what it did at this hour, releasing the day's heat in waves that rose from the concrete and the sand so that the air itself seemed to breathe. Fenn was leaning against the wall of the armory with his arms crossed and his eyes on the horizon. "Now you understand," he said. "I am still working on it," Harwell said. Fenn nodded. "That is the honest answer." They stood together for a while in the way that people who had witnessed the same thing stood together without needing to discuss it. Then Fenn said, "The program is going to survive this. Sloan will make that case because she has no choice but to make it. The Congressional Review will see what happened today in whatever sanitized form gets briefed to the committee, and they will understand that some capabilities justify their cost. That will be enough." And Carver Fenn looked at the armory wall. "She will go somewhere else," he said, "somewhere without a general who notices badges. She will be in a corner of some other room, in some other installation that does not appear on any publicly available list, maintaining her rifle and waiting for the next time ordinary options run out. She accepted that when she was 20 years old. She has never once asked me if it was the right thing to accept. Have you ever asked her no? Why not? Because Fenn said some people find their answer early and spend their whole life living inside it. Asking them whether the answer is right is like asking a river whether it made the correct decision about which way to flow. The question does not fit the thing it is being asked of. He pushed off from the wall. "She will be fine, Marcus. Fine is not the same as easy. She knows the difference. She has always known the difference." He extended his hand. Harwell shook it. Fenn walked to his battered truck and drove out through the Camp Ridgeway gate into the desert evening, trailing a thin wake of pale dust that caught the last of the day's light before dispersing into the cooling air. 3 months later, the corner of the armory at Camp Ridgeway was empty. The transfer orders had come through classified channels on a Tuesday. No destination listed, no receiving unit named, no expected duration. Carver had signed the relevant paperwork, cleared her bunk, returned the Barrett to the arms room under her custody number for the last time, and departed at 0600 on a Wednesday when November had finally persuaded Arizona to release its grip on summer. The gate guard logged her departure time. He thought nothing of it. Harwell had been in a conference call with CENTCOM when the notification came through. Voss had waited until the call ended. Harwell had nodded and returned to work, and the work had eventually covered the space. The notification opened the way work always did, the way it was designed to. The package arrived 11 days later. Official mail channels, classification stamp on the exterior requiring his security officer to be present for receipt. Inside the plain brown wrapping, padded in foam, was a badge identical to the one he had first seen in this armory 3 months ago. Identical in every detail except one. The number was different. 3,470 meters. Harwell held it for a while. Then he handed it to Voss because Voss was standing there, and because Harwell had learned over 27 years that Voss was the person you handed things to when you needed to understand them. Voss examined the badge, turned it over, found the manufacturer's mark on the reverse, a small engraving identifying the fabrication facility and order number. He ran it through the procurement database without being asked, the way he did most things. When he looked up, his face carried the expression Harwell had seen twice before. Once in the armory, when he found the pre-composed timestamp on Sloane's message. Once on the ridge, when he reported 11 hostages moving toward the south wall under their own power. The expression of a man who had found something that did not fit where it was sitting. Sir Voss said carefully. The fabrication order for this badge was placed at 0641 on the day of the Rattlesnake Ridge operation. Harwell waited. The shot Voss continued was fired at 1347. The confirmed kill was reported to the Tactical Operations Center at 1348. The badge was ordered 7 hours and 6 minutes before the trigger was pulled. Harwell sat down. He looked at the number. 3,470 meters. The exact distance. The number that had been calculated from satellite imagery on a helicopter flying south over Arizona desert. The number Voss himself had spoken aloud in the operations room when he pulled the range calculation and said it in the voice of a man not certain he was reading it correctly. That number was on this badge before the shot was taken. Not 19%, not 22 of conditions optimized, not a probability assessment offered to people who needed a number they could evaluate. Certainty. The private unannounced certainty of someone who had already completed the calculation by the time the helicopter lifted off from Camp Ridgeway, who had ordered the badge documenting her own achievement before she had technically achieved it, because the gap between what she knew and what she was willing to tell the people around her was not deception. It was the management of a reality that nobody else in that operations room had the framework to receive. Harwell sat with the badge in his hands for a long time. He thought about the balloons, the notebook, the 3 laser rangefinders triangulating an answer she had already arrived at. He thought about the word 19 and what it had actually been doing in that room, carrying the weight of other people's need to quantify, to assess, to calculate the odds of something she had already decided was going to happen. He thought about Daniel Carver. He thought about a 17-year-old girl in a doorway in Montana watching a flag being folded and making a decision in silence that no one in the room understood was being made. He thought about 8 years of becoming the answer and what it meant that the answer had known its own dimensions before anyone else in the desert had seen the question clearly. He locked the badge in his safe. He did not ask Voss to pursue further inquiries on the fabrication order. He did not attempt to trace the account that placed it or the facility that made it, or the person who had known the outcome of an impossible shot 7 hours before the variables had even been observed by anyone on the ridge. Some questions were the wrong questions, not because the answers were hidden though they were, but because the asking of them was a way of refusing to understand what you had already been shown. He had been shown enough. What he understood finally and without reservation was this. Lena Carver had not been managing 19% on that ridge. She had been managing everyone else's relationship with 19%. The number was for them a courtesy extended to people who needed probability to make decisions, while the actual calculation had been completed somewhere that probabilities did not reach in the specific cognitive architecture of a person who had spent 8 years building a capability that existed nowhere else on Earth and maintaining it every morning before the sun came up. The badge had been ordered for herself from a facility in Virginia before she left Camp Ridgeway on that helicopter. Because she already knew, because she had always already known, in the way that a river knows which direction it flows, not as a decision, but as a consequence of everything that had shaped it. 3 weeks after the package arrived, Harwell received a brief communication from Sloane. No greeting, no closing, just her initial at the bottom. Program funding secured through next budget cycle. Asset operational at new assignment. He filed it and did not respond. He did not need to know where the new assignment was. He did not need to know the name of the installation or the grid coordinate or the corner of which room she was occupying on whatever base existed at that location. He knew she was there. He knew what she was doing, which was what she always did, what she had been doing since she was 20 years old, the maintenance of a capability at personal cost so that when the moment came again, as it always came again, in some canyon or some city or on some ridge in some climate under some weather system, the answer would be there. She would release a weather balloon. She would make her calculations. She would wait for the moment when the variables aligned closely enough that the outcome moved from possible to probable, even if she had already known the outcome from the beginning. And she would give the answer, as she had in Syria, as she had in Afghanistan, as she had on a ridge in Arizona in 97-degree heat, with 11 people waiting in a courtyard and a wind that held at 13 miles per hour for long enough, as she would again. The badge in Harwell's safe was a number. The number was accurate, but the number was not the thing. The thing was older than the number and could not be engraved on anything. The thing was Daniel. The thing was a door closing in Montana. The thing was 11 years of walking down the hallway. That closing left her in toward a capability she had chosen to become, paying the cost of it every day in the currency of ordinariness and silence, in corners of rooms and the maintenance of a rifle before anyone else was awake. The thing was a badge ordered before the shot because certainty was not something she had found on that ridge. It was something she had carried there. 11 people went home. No record said why. She would never ask for one. That was the service. Invisible, unrecorded, maintained at a cost that the people it protected would never be required to understand or acknowledge. The kind of service that did not announce itself, that wore the costume of routine, that existed in the dark space between official policy and operational necessity, where certain things had to happen, and only certain people were capable of making them happen. And those people had said yes for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with a door that had closed in a specific moment and a hallway that had opened on the other side of it. Somewhere out there in a corner of a room, before sunrise, a woman with red hair was taking apart a Barrett M82A1 and putting it back together with the care of someone who understood that a single missed detail could mean the difference between the answer and the absence of it. She was maintaining the answer. She was always maintaining the answer. Because someone had to, and because 800 meters had gone unanswered once, and once had been enough.